Hi, thanks for tuning in to this presentation on new light-based technologies in photodiagnostics and phototherapy. I'm going to focus on one particular type of technology, and that is the light-emitting diode, or LEDs as they're more commonly known. Towards the end of the presentation, however, I'd also like to talk about a technology that has become particularly topical over the past few months, and that's the excimer lamp, emitting UVC radiation for the inactivation of COVID-19. First though, here are my disclosures. This presentation is going to be about 30 minutes, and I'm going to start by introducing LEDs and how they work, and how they've evolved over the past 100 years. I'll mention how we currently use them in photodermatology, and also answer the question as to why we don't have more LEDs, particularly when it comes to ultraviolet phototherapy. Then, as I've said, I will mention the excimer lamps and Far-UVC, which is currently being touted as a virus killer, but safe to the human skin and eyes. Let's start by asking ourselves the question, what is an LED? Now, you're probably very familiar with LEDs from your personal lives. So much of the modern technology upon which our life depends contains LEDs. One example is the white LED for general room illumination. And if you've been to a supermarket or a DIY store recently in trying to replace a light bulb in your home, you'll have found that LED-based light bulbs dominate the shelves. Now, this dominance has really only appeared in the domestic market in the last 5 years or so, although the first LED was actually reported as far back as 1907. For reasons that will become apparent later on in this presentation, it's important for us to understand how LEDs produce their light. An LED is made up of layers of semiconductor, whereas semiconductor, as its name implies, has only partial electrical conductivity. But that electrical conductivity can be manipulated by introducing impurities into the semiconductor. This is known as doping. Now, if an impurity, known as a dopant, has extra electrons, and that's added to a semiconductor, then the semiconductor is known as an N-type semiconductor. N standing for negative, because the electrons have a negative charge. On the flip side to that, if an impurity is introduced that has a lack of electrons, then this becomes a positive charge, and that's known as a P-type semiconductor. In LEDs, N-type and P-type semiconductors are layered, and an electrical current is applied. When that happens, the extra electrons from the N-type semiconductor travel towards the P-type semiconductor, and as they do so, they lose energy. The energy that they lose is emitted as light. The amount of energy that's lost as the electron goes from the N-type to the P-type semiconductor depends upon the material of those layers. The more energy that's lost, the shorter the wavelength of light that's emitted. And we know this because energy and wavelength are inversely proportional. Therefore, LEDs can be manufactured so that the energy that's lost matches the wavelength of light that's desired. And that's done by changing the type of material in the P and N-type semiconductor, and also by changing the type and amount of impurities. The first commercial breakthrough in LEDs came in 1962 with the production of deep red LEDs. These had a poor power output and poor efficiency, which meant that they were only suitable for displays such as alarm clocks. In 1990, the efficiency of red LEDs finally exceeded that of a filtered broadband source, which made them commercially viable for a wider range of applications. That helps us then make sense of why in the early 2000s, red LEDs were the first LEDs that we saw in our photodermatology sources in the form of the lamps that are used for photodynamic therapy. The second breakthrough for LEDs was the demonstration of a bright blue LED in 1993. As you can see from the graph here, the efficiency of these blue LEDs increased dramatically within the first 10 years, quickly catching up with and then exceeding the efficiency of the red LEDs. Blue LEDs are so important in society today because the blue LED can be combined with a phosphor coating on a bulb to produce white light. If you have any white LEDs in your home, they're most likely blue LEDs with the phosphor coating on the bulb to produce that white light. However, even the humble white LED is changing. It's now possible to buy an LED chip that has 36 different wavelength LEDs on it. And that allows the replication of natural daylight in an indoor environment, which is also being used in health research, investigating the impact on effects such as the circadian rhythm. Moving back to a more traditional healthcare setting, and it's now fairly common for newborn babies with severe jaundice to be treated with blue light. Blue LEDs are also being promoted for the treatment of psoriasis, although in my opinion the evidence is not strong enough yet, and it's not entirely clear where these blue LED products would fit into the treatment pathway. I'm not going to focus on visible light LEDs for dermatology applications anymore. If you'd like to know a bit more, there was a review published in 2018 in Lasers in Surgery and Medicine. Instead, I'd like to focus on UV LEDs and specifically for their use in UV phototherapy. The reason that I've gone into some depth in the use of visible LEDs is that I wanted to explain that whilst it would appear as if LEDs have been around for a long time, actually their commercial development is fairly recent. And UV LEDs are further behind in this development than the visible light. So whilst you can purchase UV LEDs of just about any wavelength, often their power and their efficiency are not sufficient for photodermatology applications. As you can see from this slide, there is a market for UV LEDs, and the medical market, shown in the purple boxes, is just a small part of the overall picture. Because there's such a wide range of different disciplines, there is demand for UV LEDs, and so we anticipate that there will be quite a high growth in this area. As I've mentioned already, UV LEDs are commercially available. You can purchase just about any wavelength of UV LED. But unfortunately, their efficiencies are highly wavelength dependent, and it's not possible really to get high output powers either. As this graph from 2018 shows, the most efficient UV LEDs are at wavelengths above 370 nanometers, although there's also a peak at 280 nanometers. However, unfortunately, the key wavelength for us in photodermatology, the 311 nanometers, that's where you see the dip in efficiency. The reason for the high efficiencies of the UVA LEDs above 370 nanometers is that these use the indium gallium nitride technology that is also used in the visible LEDs. Therefore, these longer wavelength UVA LEDs have benefited from the decades of industrial investment in this type of technology. And in fact, they have efficiencies which are very similar to the blue LEDs. However, despite these high efficiencies, we don't see the widespread availability of UVA1 phototherapy systems. The reason for this might be due to optical power output. So take as an example this 365 nanometer UVA1 LED lamp on the left of the slide and compare it to the fluorescent tube on the right. Now, as you can see from the table, the efficiency of the UVA1 lamp is far superior to the fluorescent lamp, 35% efficient versus the 26% of the fluorescent lamp. But the optical power output is much lower. In fact, it's 7 times lower, which means treatment with the UVA1 LED lamp would take 7 times longer. Now, given that UVA1 phototherapy treatment times are already in the region of about 30 minutes for one treatment session, this would lead to several hours of phototherapy with the LED-based system, which is clearly not practical. So whilst the efficiencies of UVA1 LEDs are good, the optical power outputs still have to be improved upon. For wavelengths that are below 370 nanometers, which are based upon the aluminium gallium nitride technology, which hasn't benefited from those decades of industrial development that the visible and longer wavelength UV LEDs have. For this technology in our UVB region of our phototherapy, there are a number of challenges, both with the material and also with the wavelengths that are emitted as well. This means that the current efficiencies of UV LEDs below 370 nanometers is poor. So take for a comparison here in the slide, a 310 nanometer LED as shown on the right, and compare it with the 365 nanometer LED that we were looking at in one of the previous slides. The first thing to notice, of course, is that the 310 nanometer LED hasn't even been put into a lamp system. It's just an LED on a chip. It's not actually been thought worth combining these LED chips into a lamp system, so it's not anywhere near as far developed as its 365 counterpart. The second thing to notice is how poor the efficiency is, just 1.7%. And then finally, the power output, 280 times less than its 365 nanometer counterpart. I've painted a fairly bleak picture there, but actually growth in UV LED technology is expected to be rapid over the next decade, and it's predicted that by 2025, the 310 nanometer UV LEDs will have an efficiency of 30%, which would then make them commercially viable systems. But why should we care about UV LEDs? What advantages do they have over our current fluorescent tube systems? Well, this slide compares UV LEDs with conventional lamps. It's actually been taken from an industrial website, so it's not specifically tailored to the purposes of photodermatology. But if we look at each of these advantages, we can see how they might be applicable in our discipline. So for example, heat generation. UV phototherapy cabinets get very hot. The rooms that they're in often get very hot and often require additional air conditioning. So a lower heat generation would be a welcome aspect both for patients and for staff as well. A much shorter warm-up time for the lamps, better stability of the light output would help us with better defining the dosimetry and the dose that the patient's actually receiving. Lower energy consumption is clearly a beneficial aspect from both the hospital's financial position, but also from an environmental perspective as well. And a better defined emission wavelength without the additional peaks could be an advantage, as it might allow us to investigate what actually is the optimum wavelength for treating many conditions with UV phototherapy. And then finally, a longer lifetime of the LEDs would clearly be beneficial because it would mean less replacement of lamps in whatever treatment devices that there are. However, I think these benefits, while nice and while useful, none of them are really groundbreaking. And for me, they all miss overcoming the biggest problem that there is with UV phototherapy. And for me, the biggest problem with UV phototherapy is its inconvenience. And I think if LED-based systems are built that just replicate what we already have, then we're missing out on the true advantage of LEDs, which is their ability to be small and flexible. The current phototherapy cabinet designs are only that way because they had to fit the fluorescent tubes, which was the technology that was available at the time. With LEDs, there's the opportunity really to revolutionize how phototherapy is delivered. When UV LEDs are efficient and powerful enough, I want to see their size and flexibility taken advantage of. As I've already mentioned, for me the biggest problem with UV phototherapy is its inconvenience. Having to attend the hospital 3 times a week for 10 weeks. And that hospital might be far away from you, so you've got a long journey. Might not be possible because of poor public transport. Or it might just take you a long time to get there because the hospital's in a busy city. And it takes a long time just to cross the city to get to the phototherapy centre. And then, of course, if you travel by car, when you get there, there's the parking that needs to be paid for as well. And many of our phototherapy centres already have long waiting lists. That was pre-coronavirus. Now, post-coronavirus, those waiting lists have only got longer, and the capacity of our phototherapy centres will also have diminished as well. And I think that inconvenience factor can lead to people not selecting phototherapy as a treatment option. And it can also actually lead people to look for alternatives, such as attending sunbed parlours or even buying their own phototherapy units as well. I don't want UV LEDs to simply recreate the phototherapy cabinet. I think that would be a complete waste of their potential. What I'd like to see is for home phototherapy to be revolutionised. I mean, why not have phototherapy while you sleep? Why not have pajamas made out of UV LEDs? And seal those pajamas around the ankles and around the wrists and around the neck, and then you don't have to worry about eye safety. And all of a sudden you're delivering UV phototherapy while somebody sleeps. I mean, what could be more convenient than that? It's almost as convenient as just taking a tablet. So where then are we on this path towards the utopian UV LED phototherapy dream? Not very far would be the answer. So to my knowledge, there is still only one publication that's looked at 310 nanometer UV LED phototherapy for the skin. And that was the paper published by Kameni et al. In 2010. And that looked at a device which had been developed for research. It emitted 1 milliwatt per centimeter squared, and it showed effective treatment of psoriasis plaques. The device in question was developed by a company called Alux Medical, which unfortunately no longer appear to be in business. But as UV LEDs become more efficient, more powerful, and of course cheaper, we can probably expect more devices like this one. This device can be purchased over the internet, and it's available in two different versions. One with 9 LEDs claiming to emit 2.2 milliwatts per centimeter squared, and another with 21 LEDs which claims to emit 4.5 milliwatts per centimeter squared. And this has been targeted directly to the consumer. There is of course a danger of the purchase of such devices directly from the internet. Many of these, if they are from out with the EU, will bypass our regulations, and that regulatory framework is there in order to protect people, to ensure that the quality of the system is of the highest standard. New EU regulations, which are due to come in next year, now specify that any device that emits high intensity ultraviolet radiation, whether it's for a medical purpose or not, still needs to be classed as a medical device if it's for use on the human skin. Now what that means is that not only does it have to prove safety, it also has to prove efficacy. That of course is reassuring for clinicians and healthcare providers. The flip side to that, of course, is that this regulation might slow innovation and might limit the amount of devices that we see in the future. Now, if you remember, I did say that UVA1 LEDs were more efficient than UVB LEDs. So you might expect, therefore, that there would be more UVA1 phototherapy LED systems. But of course, we have to remember that UVA1 phototherapy is not as common as UVB phototherapy. And so actually, we don't see much in this area. There is a research group in Nagoya, Japan, who have produced a UVA1 LED-based phototherapy system in connection with Ushio, a lamp manufacturer. And they have published on that and presented at conferences as well. Now, you may recognize the name Ushio, and that's because Ushio is the company that's been promoting quite heavily the Far-UVC as a apparently effective light source for killing viruses and bacteria, but that is safe for humans. And I'm going to come on and talk about Far-UVC in a couple of slides' time. But first, let's summarize what we've learned about UV LEDs. UV LEDs are not efficient or powerful enough in order to deliver phototherapy. At least not yet. But maybe they would be suitable for photodiagnostics, which requires lower radiance and smaller exposure areas. There's not been much published in that area over the past few years, but there are a few projects that are ongoing, and maybe in the next couple of years I'll be able to come back and tell you a bit more about those. We can almost guarantee that there is going to be rapid development of UV LED technology, in particular because the COVID-19 outbreak has led to the rapid development of UVC LEDs, and I'm going to be talking more about UVC next. And whilst UV LEDs will get more powerful and they will get more efficient, for me, I think it's the design of the final device that is the critical component. I don't think there's any point in filling up UV cabinets with LEDs. Instead, I would like to see a revolution in the home UV phototherapy with smart LED-based devices. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about Far-UVC. It's been well known for well over 100 years now that UVC radiation has germicidal properties, killing bacteria and viruses. And indeed, 254 nanometer UVC radiation produced by mercury is used routinely in the disinfection of water, air and surfaces. But there are some safety considerations because at this wavelength there's a sunburn induced on the human skin, and also it causes a painful photokeratitis to the human eyes. And therefore, that particular wavelength of UVC can't be used in populated areas. And apparently, the solution is Far-UVC, emitted from excimer lamps, either at 207 nanometers, or is more commonly being pushed at the moment, 222 nanometers. Now, apparently, this wavelength of radiation is short enough that it can destroy the virus, but not pass beyond the stratum corneum in the skin, and therefore is apparently safe for humans. There is good laboratory evidence to show that Far-UVC at 222 nanometers is effective at killing both bacteria and viruses. Most of this work has come out of Columbia University, and this graph here on the slide shows the effect of 222 nanometers on two different strains of coronavirus, neither of which is the current strain of coronavirus, but there's no reason to expect that the behaviour would be any different. And again, in the laboratory and in mice, the evidence is compelling for Far-UVC safety. A research group at Kobe University in Japan has shown that mice who are susceptible to UV-induced skin cancers, when chronically exposed to Far-UVC radiation, there was no induction of tumours. Now, whilst the laboratory studies and the evidence are good, very robust and very encouraging, there is a lack of real-world studies. Our unit undertook a clinical study in 2014 looking at the effects of Far-UVC on human skin. And that clinical study actually appears to contradict most of the other evidence that's available. It showed that erythema was induced at doses below that which are required for bacteria disinfection. And it also showed that there was DNA damage present both in the upper epidermis and in the basal layer as well. However, some computer modelling that we published just a few months ago seems to suggest that it might have been longer wavelengths that were present in the excimer lamp that were causing the DNA damage in that basal layer. And this is encouraging because it might explain why the clinical study in 2014 appears to contradict much of the other research that's been published. However, whilst the Far-UVC wavelength at 222 nanometer didn't appear to cause CPD in the basal layer according to the computer modelling, it did still cause CPDs in the upper and the mid-basal layer. And therefore, the computer modelling is far from conclusive. And really, we need a real-life, real-world study in humans to test this technology. This has actually been done by a group in Japan. It hasn't been published on, but it has been presented at several conferences. Unfortunately, that study was performed on the back of the human hand, which we know is not particularly sensitive to ultraviolet radiation, and also that they only looked for erythema at 24 hours. Now, in the original study that we did in 2014, we saw that the UVC-induced erythema appeared within sort of 5 to 6 hours and could disappear as quickly as 1 hour. So in summary, the laboratory results for this Far-UVC technology are very encouraging, both in terms of its efficacy and its safety. But there's a real lack of real-world studies. The hype around this technology at the moment is exponential, and I think we just need to take a little bit of optimistic caution for the time being. Thank you for listening to this presentation today. Please do remember to look at our YouTube channel if you'd like some more material on photodermatology education. Thank you.